Hi, my name's Aaron, and it's an honor to be here at OMS. It's a pretty well-known club throughout the country. So made the drive down today, and you guys were all so hospitable with the delicious dinner. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I'm a mushroom nerd, kind of been that way ever since I was a little kid. My grandma was taught by her stepmom, who came from Japan with her, mycophilic mushroom knowledge about matsutake and foraging, and just impressed on me how fascinating the world of fungi was, and I've just always been hooked. And so it's cool that it's turned into all of this. She mentioned that I have a YouTube channel called Mushroom Wonderland. I have some free stickers for people to check it out. But I just thought it'd be cool to make a TV show about mushrooms. And so there wasn't one, so I made one. And I do travel vlogs and hang out with mycologists and cooking stuff and just everything mushroom related. It's a lot of fun. This is kind of the intro that some people might recognize.
Welcome to Mushroom Wonderland.
Okay, so the talk tonight is going to be mycological history. And I explained to some people earlier at dinner where I got the idea for this. I intercepted some files that were going to get tossed out that didn't have a place to get stored. They'd been in the Mushroom Club forever, for years and years. And I came across a class outline by Dr. Daniel Stuntz from University of Washington. And one part of his outline was the history of mycologia, which I found fascinating. It was just kind of a short one-page thing about the people he thought should have been remembered. So I adapted that paper into this talk. I added a lot of mushrooms that they describe that we might recognize. You'll see. But it's kind of a fun time travel mushroom journey to kind of get familiar with the first people that started caring about mushrooms and naming them and things like that. So we'll just get started. So early humans and mushrooms, humans discovered wild mushrooms as a food source through trial and error, obviously. Knowledge of the environment and mushroom types were passed down through generations. They were likely so commonly used that they didn't keep big record of them or make too many wall carvings and things like that. But there are some in the world. There's not much fossil evidence of fungi. And there's a theory known as the stoned ape hypothesis that suggests that psychedelic mushrooms may have influenced human cognitive evolution. If you're not familiar with that, I suggest you look it up. It was cooked up by Terrence and Dennis McKenna. It was really cool at Telluride Mushroom Festival last summer. Dennis McKenna revisited the idea of the stoned ape theory or hypothesis. And if you got an open mind, it's pretty convincing. So the earliest mushroom use, radiocarbon dating techniques discovered the spores of bolete and agaricoid mushrooms from the tooth plaque of a nearly 19,000-year-old woman in a cave in the El Miran cave in Cantabria, Spain. And she was covered in this iron oxide pigment, so they call her the Red Lady. But it was obvious that she had been eating a variety of different wild mushrooms 19,000 years ago, which is pretty cool. People probably have heard of this. Let's see, the Iceman. And this is a perfectly preserved mummy that was found in the Alps between Austria and Italy. He's thought to be about 5,300 years old. And some interesting things about him, his knees and his ankle joints were really worn out. And so they think that he traveled a lot through the mountains. My theory is he was just a really avid mushroom hunter and maybe got lost. But he had an arrow in him, so that's not good. But sewn on the strap of his satchel were these mushrooms on the top, known as Fomitopsis betulina or the birch polypore. And they were likely used to cure intestinal parasites and also used as a styptic. So you could take a slab of the mushroom and put it over a wound and wrap it, and that would help it from getting infected. And that picture there is one of the most recent ones that was found right there in the Alps near Tyrol, Austria, on iNaturalist. And this is so small, I can't, yeah, that was found just a couple years ago. And then the one on the bottom, the tinder conch was found inside of his satchel. And he may have used this to carry an ember. So it's known as a tinder conch, and you could put a live ember in there. It was the equivalent of a Bic lighter back in those days. So you could carry a coal with you and start a fire wherever you went. And that also is a picture from right near the area where he was found, from 2025, from just last year. So kind of cool to see. That's probably the same mushroom. It probably didn't look too much different from that 5,300 years ago. So up to the 16th century, the scientific knowledge of fungi scarcely advanced beyond what was known by the Greeks and the Romans, namely how to recognize a few edible, and poisonous ones, but nothing about their structure or biology. And that guy's saying all mushrooms are edible once, hee hee. And then that lady's saying, shut it. That's not what edible means. Stop saying that. So European taxonomy and mycology, this is the region of the world where historic records and attempts to classify and organize fungi started. It's not the first people to do it. In China, they had a great knowledge of mushrooms, but they didn't really take account of them, like the Europeans wanted to. Ironically, it's also where a deep-seated fear of fungi came from, known as mycophobia. A lot of these early botanists that started studying mushrooms were big time mushroom haters, which is weird because a lot of these mushrooms are named things like delicious and edible, even though I don't think they ate a lot of them. Um, yeah. So the purpose of taxonomy is to help determine the ancestry of an organism for communication between each other, to become familiar with the benefits or the dangers of fungal organisms. So taxonomy of fungi is constantly changing, which makes it a little bit confusing. New understanding of these organisms through DNA testing has caused a lot of recent changes. Some people are stubborn to those changes, but it really has opened up our eyes to, things that were just based on macromorphology in the past. Now, um, a lot of things have been rearranged. So it's a growing science. You can help contribute by uploading your finds, take nice photos of them, upload them onto iNaturalist, and then researchers can start to build, a nice database, and we can get an understanding of where these fungi occur and whether or not they're, rare or endangered. So, just a bunch of disorganization and confusion up to this point. Until the late 1700s, there was no unified way of classifying mushrooms. Everybody was just given the same thing, different names, from different regions. So it made it almost impossible to communicate in a scientific sense about what that organism is, because they called it one thing in France, a different thing in Germany. So, back then, plant and mushroom names would be known by this long, confusing set of Latin and Greek names, often regionally different. And then some people started caring about them. Yeah, you can see that guy saying, "You're spreading information, misinformation," and he's saying, "No, you are." We still have those arguments. So, this book, called the Ortus Sanitatis, came out in 1491, written by this Jacob Maidenbach. And this is the first ever published photograph of a fungi, of a mushroom, if you will. This is a super interesting book. If you look into the Ortus Sanitatis, it's like the first, herbal botanical, if you will. This guy said, "I'm going to describe every plant, animal on Earth," and so he didn't travel a lot, so he heard like hearsay. So in his book, he also had mermaids and dragons and unicorns, mandrake root, all these cool things, and he really thought that this was really gave real descriptions. But he put this picture, didn't talk a lot about the mushrooms, but, he was aware of them. So, talking to other friends and colleagues in the mycological world, we've kind of come to determine that this must be Marasmius orates, or the fairy ring mushroom. It looks like it. And this picture, he wrote this book around Mainz, Germany. And so this is an iNaturalist observation of the most recent, Marasmius orates growing right there in Mainz, Germany in 2022. It's probably what he was looking at. The yellow stipes, would point towards marasmius, and the fact that it's growing in grass. It's an interesting mushroom, the fairy ring mushroom. In Latin, orates refers to mountain nymphs or fairies. And so a lot of, tradition thought that these rings that you see in the grass or out in fields, and you can even see them in the forest sometimes, were actually formed by fairies that were dancing in the night and could entice you with their music, and you would dance till you die. It's kind of a morbid, thing. But there's also other traditions that thought it's good luck to step into a fairy ring. Other ones that thought it was bad luck. In Germany, they thought that's where witches were casting spells, and in Romania, they thought that's where a dragon had landed. but they're a good edible. They taste a little bit like Parmesan cheese, but they have a really tough stipe that you might want to discard. And they dry them and sell them in France. It's a really popular edible mushroom. But beware if you're picking them in treated lawns because they are bioaccumulators. So in 1640, this guy came along, John Parkinson from England, and he wrote this book called The Theater of Plants or Theatrum Botanicum. And so this is what he wrote about mushrooms. He said, "But I know the Hungarians, Germans, and others gather them, of those that grow in the woods under fir trees and under oaks, to pick and to dry them as one pleases. Some boil and drain and press the water out of them, and then slice and put oil and vinegar on them, a little salt, or as others please, sugar and some spice, and to eat them cold. Others put butter and sugar and spice and eat them hot, or boil them with milk or cream or fat broth. Others slice them and throw fine flour on them, and then fry them with butter, fat, or oil." So fried mushrooms, back in the 1600s, he says people are eating them cold with sugar on them. What the? So, so here's some of his illustrations. What he called fungus muscarius. You might recognize this as the Amanita muscaria or the fly agaric. And what he had to say about this mushroom is that they are said to kill as many flies as will fit on them, as well as when they are dry or fresh, some of them being greater and broader than others, and some much redder with white spots, all of them grow in the woods. Um, and they used it as an insecticide back in the day. It was People would put it in their windowsill, and it was thought that it would intoxicate the flies, but a lot of people think that the flies would just try to get a drink and then drown. But some pretty cool pictures. You could see the Copernellus mycaceus right here. It's pretty recognizable. In 1727, this guy came along, Sebastian Vaillant, and he was a doctor and a surgeon with a deep interest in fungi, plants, the natural world. He became too old and poor to publish his 36-year work, and it was published 5 years after his death. But he was the botanist to the King of France, and he worked in the royal garden. He even uh, keyed the terms stamen, ovary, and egg for botany. And he created this book called the Botanicon Paracense, or the Plants of France, in which fungi were so carefully observed and so well illustrated that many can be recognized today. So he said, "I decided to go ahead and draw the mushrooms realistically." And here's some of his drawings that are just beautiful. It looks like this page is mostly things in the Cantharellacea. So you got chanterelles and, I'm not sure about that, but it looks like a winter chanterelle. And I find this really cool. He shows the whole spectrum from a baby going to full maturity. And then even this one that's starting to deliquesce, which I thought was kind of neat because sometimes you find mushrooms when they're past their prime, and we need pictures of that too to be able to really know what it is. So I thought that was a neat inclusion. And then if you look at this really mechanical looking mushroom up here on the top right, it might be familiar. And he was the first one to describe the death cap. And that's that. He called it Fungus phalloides annulatus sortidae virescens patulus. So if you think that, these scientific names are tricky now, imagine back then. But Fungus phalloides refers to the mushroom shaped like a phallus, yes. Annulatus refers to the annulus, or the ring right here. Sortidae virescens means dirty greenish, which is a good description. And patulus means a flat cap with age. And this is a picture from Meudon, France, from August of last year. So this is probably what Sebastian Vaillant was looking at. And there's been a huge outbreak of those here on the West Coast and in California with, I think, 4 deaths now. And, several dozen people have been hospitalized this year. Be sure you know what you're picking. Then along came this guy in 1729, Pierre A. Micoli, and he is considered the founder of mycology. So he was an Italian botanist and a Catholic priest, and he's the one who devised the first logical classification of fungi. He was the first to examine them with a crude microscope, pretty much the power equal to a modern hand lens today. But he was the first to demonstrate that fungal spores, which in those days were called seminal dust, were the fungi's means of sexual reproduction. So up to that point, they couldn't figure out how these things reproduced. They thought they were plants. In fact, till 1969, they called them plants. But they couldn't figure out where's the flower, where's the seed. And actually, mushrooms are called fruiting bodies, but they're actually kind of more like a flower, the way that they put spores off, because the spores have to sexually mate. They don't just drop a seed that's ready to go in one package. So there's a little sidetrack. I don't need to repeat that. So Nikolai discovered that putting the spores on a melon would germinate and grow. So prior to that, people thought that fungi were born of spontaneous generation. They just God made them grow or something like that. Contemporary botanists were skeptical of his work. He described Aspergillus. This is a oh whoops. This is a mold that can infect humans, and there's something called an aspergilloma removal, where this will actually grow a big hyphal mass in your lung, and they have to cut it out of there, which is pretty nasty. He also described botrytis, which is a gray mold, and sometimes it's used deliberately on wine grapes to make them sweeter. But when you get strawberries in the store and it has that little gray mold on them, that's botrytis. So Nicolai died in 1736 in Florence, Italy, from pleurisy he contracted on a collecting expedition. Linnaeus named the plant genus Michelaia after him. This is the banana magnolia named after Nicolai. And he was buried in a doctoral gown, even though he never received a degree. So he is a pioneer of citizen science. He was an amateur who just had a real deep passion for plants and fungi, had no formal training, but made huge marks in the mycological world. Then came this guy, Carl Linnaeus, in 1757. He's considered the father of modern taxonomy. And he founded the binomial system of scientific names in 1758, where the name consists of two words. So instead of that big crazy string of words, he just broke it down to two. So he's a Swedish naturalist and an explorer. And he categorized fungi as cryptogamia, which translates into hidden sexual organs. He just couldn't tell where the sexual organs were on fungi. Um, so he described many fungi. He put most gilled mushrooms in a broad genus that he called Agaricus. And he defined the genus Boletus, which all sponge pore mushrooms fell into. They've since been split into a whole bunch of different genera. But here are some of the mushrooms that he named and described that you might recognize, and they still hold up today. Excuse me. The Amanita muscaria, he called it Agaricus muscarius, described this in 1753. So musca means fly in Latin, and it was powdered and added to milk as an insecticide, hence the common name, the fly agaric. Some others think that the term fly refers not to insects, but rather a delirium that results in consuming the fungus. It contains intoxicants. It's been used as a psychoactive type mushroom for millennia, but it's not a psychedelic like you're thinking of magic mushrooms. But here is one that is from Sweden, right near where he was growing up. So this is probably what it looked like. Super common, most recognizable mushroom in the world. If you ask any kid in the world to draw you a mushroom, they're going to draw that one. He knew about the intoxicating effects of Amanita muscaria. He even compiled this list of inebriating plants in 1762. Kind of interesting. It's got cannabis and tobacco and all kinds of things in there. So he was interested in that sort of thing. He described Lactarius deliciosus as Agaricus deliciosus in 1753. The name literally means delicious, and it's been eaten all over the world for a long time. Surprisingly, Linnaeus did not eat mushrooms, and he held high contempt and suspicion for them. He was quoted as saying, "The Swedish do not eat mushrooms, only foreigners do." So he was one of the OG mycophobes who contributed to the fear of mushrooms in Europe. The sentiment still echoes in the Western world today. That's why we have one grocery store button mushroom. Luckily, we're starting to see more showing up in the grocery stores, but for a long time, people were just scared of mushrooms. He also named Hydnum repandum, or the hedgehog mushroom, in 1753. Yeah, the word hydnum is derived from Greek for the term truffle. So he also knew about the culinary value of truffles. So he would name these mushrooms after delicious things and describe them as delicious. Here's one of our local hedgehogs. We have about 6 or 7 species here in the Pacific Northwest, but they're really hard to tell apart morphologically. You might see one and call it a belly button hedgehog and then have it sequenced and it'll come back as Washingtoniensis or something. So I don't know. Noah Siegel says we just call them hidden species. Don't try to put names on them. But this one was found right there in the woods of Sweden near where Linnaeus was. And it looks a lot like ours. And the nice thing about that genus Hydnum is that they're all edible and they're all considered choice edible. He described the meadow mushroom or Agaricus campestris in 1753. He was naming all these mushrooms in 1753. This is one of the mushrooms that retained the name Agaricus. Like I said, he put everything in Agaricus at first. That genus still exists, but it's not nearly as big as it used to be. And here on the left are some that were photographed September of last year, right in Sweden near his hometown. And then these ones are at a rest stop on I-90 that I stop by every year and pick. They're really good with eggs. So scientific naming. So a type species refers to the species that defines the characteristics of a genus. Most of these really old collections, if there ever were any, have been lost to time. They just don't survive since 1753. So there isn't a type species of Amanita muscaria. But sometimes an iconotype is used for the type species where a scientific illustration serves as the primary reference for a biological species when a physical specimen has been lost. And then there's something called a neotype. So basically, you could go to the forest near where Carl Linnaeus had described it from, much like I put those pictures from my naturalist up there, and say this must have been what he was looking at, and that can serve as the new type. So if you want to name a mushroom, you have to go through the International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi, and Plants. And if you want to name them, but you don't need a special title. Anyone can do it, provided you follow some pretty strict guidelines, and people get pissed off at you if you do a bad job. So in 1780, Pierre Bouillard came along, and he was a French botanist who published the Herbs of France in 1780 with 200 engraved copper plates of mushrooms. So he developed a system of printing that he took to his grave. It remains a mystery to this day. People who are into printing are still baffled by how he did it. In 1779, he commenced a work on the book called The Poisonous Plants of France, but it was seized by the police on the grounds that it was dangerous work. And iNaturalist has had rumors of similar censorship following recent poisonings in Australia. I don't know if you guys heard about that, where that lady invited her ex-in-laws over for a luncheon and fed them all death caps. Well, she found those death caps through iNaturalist. So people were saying, well, should we obscure all of the poisonous mushrooms? That's ridiculous. But, people are still out there doing this stuff. So he died in a hunting accident. It was not mushroom hunting, though, so that's good. So he said, I'll write a book about natural poison. What could possibly go wrong, right? I don't know if he said that. I just put that in there. So here's some of Bouillard's illustrations. This is a Lexinum or a scaber stalk. Look how beautiful his illustrations were. And you can see the scabers there, commonly around here known as the birch bolete. And these are an okay edible. I guess they cause GI upset in some people. I've never met anybody that had trouble with them. But this one was found in October of last year, right in France, near where he would have drawn these. So beautiful artwork. He described the Boletus edulis, our beloved porcini, or the cep, or the penny bun, or the king, we call it. It is the type species of the genus and section Boletus. Boletus has stayed the same since Carl Linnaeus named it, but tons of things got moved out of there. This complex has at least 5 subspecies, but it's quite a mess trying to differentiate them. So we just call them all Boletus edulis. Here's some beautiful ones I found in Port Orchard, Washington last year. And this is one found in September of last year in France, right near where Bouillard was doing his work. He also described the Chalciporus piperatus. This one's known as the peppery bolete. If you take a little nibble of it, it's very spicy. Not suggested to eat a whole bunch of it, but it's recently been discovered that it's parasitic on Amanita muscaria. So wherever you see these, underground is the mycelium of the Amanita muscaria. Even if you don't see the fruiting body, they're always kind of growing in a partnership. Some people call this the spy for that reason, because also Amanita muscaria can be found around porcini. They like similar habitats. So if you see the Chalciporus, it could be spying on a porcini as well. Colibia nuda. This has gone through a lot of name changes recently, but we're going to call it Colibia. The wood bluet, widely eaten mushroom. It was originally called Agaricus nudus, and he called it that because it was often confused in France for the violet cortinarius. But this one was nude, meaning it doesn't have the cobwebby veil here that a cortinarius would. So he called it the nude um, mushroom. And it smells of frozen orange juice concentrate, which is really crazy. These are some beautiful ones that came up right near my house in Port Orchard. And this one was found in November of last year, right in France, near where he did his work. In 1801, you guys might recognize this name. So when there's a mushroom description, it'll say the Latin name, and then in parentheses next to it, it'll have usually an abbreviation of a name, and PERS shows up on a lot of them. Christian Pursoon was really big in the mycology game. So he published his synopsis, Methodica Fungorum, in 1801, and it revolutionized fungal taxonomy. So what he did is he came along and he took all the fragments of work. The guy's using the microscope over there. This person's describing things over there. And he took all those fragments and he organized them into an acceptable classification based mainly on macro observation. So just looking at a mushroom, this is what you see, this is what you get. So he moved to Paris, where he spent his later life unemployed, unmarried, poverty stricken, and a recluse, but he still did manage to study mushrooms. That was his true love, I guess. So here's some of his work. Oh, he says, this is crazy. I'm going to organize this stuff. So he was responsible for defining the genus Russula in 1796, which now contains over 3,400 species. And without DNA stuff, we would never know that Hericium and the ear pick fungus, that these are also in the Russell alleys. You would never be able to tell that from macromorphology, just looking at them. You wouldn't think that they were related at all, but they are. Um, he described Lycoperdon perlatum in 1809. The word Lycoperdon literally means wolf fart. So, and these are tasty when they're young with firm white flesh inside, but when they get older, you kick them and the spores come out. I don't know, when you're a kid walking to the bus stop, that's what I always think of. We would kick the puffballs, but he named it the wolf fart. And Mycena hematopus, or some people call it the bleeding bonnet. This one's really cool. It was originally named Agaricus hematopus, and then it was moved by Paul Coomer in 1871, but it bleeds when it's cut or damaged, so you can take a sharp knife or a razor and cut it, and this exudate comes out of it. It's just an alkaloid pigment in the water, and you can let them heal, and they'll actually heal up and keep living. You can come back and cut them again and again and again and again if you're a real weirdo. I don't know. The false morel. He described this one, Gyromitra esculenta. We should be seeing these popping up really soon if they're not already up. But the species epithet means edible or suitable for consumption, which is potentially deadly unless specially prepared through methods of detoxification. So back in the day, they would eat them and they thought they tasted good, but once in a while, somebody fall over dead. And they started to see more and more accounts of poisonings before they said, okay, maybe these aren't that safe. In 1971, a Polish study reported at that time that the species accounted for up to 23% of mushroom fatalities each year. So pretty deadly mushroom, especially if you eat it raw. So he also gave morels their current name, Morchella, while Linnaeus described it 48 years earlier as Phallus esculenta, which literally means edible penis. Okay, good night. But it does, though. That's weird. Gyromitra esculenta. This was found in France. These ones are in Port Orchard. They look pretty much the same. Some people call them the brain mushroom. This one looks like fried chicken, kind of, but yeah. They grow in the same habitat as morels and other things in Morchellaceae, so they are a good indicator species. So in 1821, Elias Magnus Fries came along, and he was born in 1794 in Sweden, became interested in fungi at 7 years old. He produced Systema Mycologium in 1821, which established him as the foremost mycological authority of that time. He was only 27 years old. And he described 3,210 different species of mushrooms in his career. That's astounding. He made use of spore color and macromorphology to separate families of mushrooms. He had 9 children, 4 of them went into taxonomy, and 2 of them became mycologists. And he didn't particularly believe in microscopes. He thought that they were pretty much unnecessary. But he created a system which included what he called tribus, 12 of them, based on macromorphological features. And they're really still in use today. So we'll take a look at what Fries did. He put these mushrooms basically into 12 categories that you'll recognize. His first one was agaricus. Most gilled mushrooms were still in agaricus. But number 2, cantharellus, so meaning decurrent veins. Um, these veins that run down the stipe. So you got Gomphus, Craterellus, Cantharellus. He put them all in Cantharellus. That was his second tribus. Marulius, meaning anastomosing veins. These veins split off. They'll fork and look all wavy and cool like that Marasmius candidus right there. Schizophyllum, or the split gills. These mushrooms split. This is with a 365 UV light. That's not the natural color. Oops. Vidalia, so labyrinth form gills. They look like a labyrinth underneath, even though I think that might be not the right picture. Yeah, that's okay. Polyporous, round, hard pores. So, your Fomitopsis mountier, your red-belted conch. This is one I found that was a mushroom of a mushroom. Isn't that cool? Boletus. So this has soft round pores, but they're inseparable from each other. You can tear off chunks of the sponge, but it's very irregular. Beautiful. Porcini, probably my favorite mushroom to eat. Fistulina. This is one of his tribus. This means soft round pores that are separable from each other. So these are crazy. These beefsteak mushrooms, you can peel the pores apart from each other. If you ever come across one of these, just play with it a little bit. Super fun. Hydnum. So anything with tooth-like spines, there's pseudo-hydnum. There's one of those, a pretty big one on that back table back there. The cat's tongue, the hedgehogs. Cystotrema, meaning flat spines. Phlebia, meaning irregular warts and wrinkles. Thylophora, a smooth surface. This is the stinking earth fan. This thing really stinks, man. It's like a tiny little one in my collection box, like stunk up my whole truck last fall. So he described the chanterelle here, Cantharellus cibarius. So North American golden chanterelles were once all called this, but later DNA analysis proved them to be a complex of related but distinct species, and as a result, the name Cantharellus cibarius sensu stricto is now restricted to the European species, and this one was found in Sweden, near where Fries was doing his work. So that was probably what he was looking at. Looks a lot like our Cantharellus formosus, probably the most popularly foraged wild edible here. He described Psilocybe semelanciata in 1838 as Agaricus semelanciatus, and it got moved into its own genus in 1871 by Paul Coomer. In 2005, Daconica split away from Psilocybe because the genus was discovered to be polyphyletic, so they just moved everything that was non-active into Mycological, which is kind of an unusual thing. But here's one that's growing in Sweden, and these ones were found out on the Washington coast last year. Powerful psychoactive mushroom, if you're not familiar. So Fries started making, but he was resistant to change. He started doing slight revisions after beginning to use the microscope. His changes were mostly to microfungi like thrusts and rusts and molds. But he did eventually start splitting some of the genera out of the original all-inclusive Agaricus. And his classification dominated taxonomy of mushrooms well into the 1900s. And you still hear people talking about Fries. In 1834, this guy came along, August Forta, and he was the director of the National Museum in Prague, and he was a self-taught lithographer and an engraver and a mycologist. And he started to notice a thing that would lead to the modern era of mycology, microscopic details of spores. So he wrote a landmark in mycology called All of Those Words. I kind of And he demonstrated the advantages of the microscope and the infinite variety of microscopic fungal structures. He survived an assassination attempt for his political leanings. He was sent to Texas to collect specimens for the museum, though he perished in a shipwreck on his return voyage in 1849, and all of his mushrooms went with him. And that's not funny, just saying. In 1865, this guy comes along. He was a big player, Charles Horton Peck. And after working 48 years, he left a legacy of 2,700 new species, over 4,000 published papers, about 36,000 specimens in his herbarium. His major interest was gilled mushrooms, but he also described many species in other families. He described the Amanita ocreata, the West Coast destroying angel, which was recognized as being distinct from the other destroying angels. He was a health nut, a rock climber, and a devout Christian. I can't really picture this guy climbing mountains, but that's what he did. This mushroom was named after him, the Hiddenellum peckii. I just kind of put this one in here because it's so stunning. And these were growing right near my house. Yeah, whoops. Some people are really excited about, this is their basket list mushroom or bucket list, whatever you want to call it. But they're really common in my neck of the woods, but I never get tired of seeing them. Then we get our first woman mycologist in 1870s named Mary Elizabeth Banning, and she formally described 23 previously unknown species of fungi. She wasn't really well accepted in the mycological community, so she bought a microscope and she started to amass a scientific library and a private herbarium. And she collected and worked on mushrooms all by herself. And she is the author of The Fungi of Maryland, an unpublished manuscript containing scientific descriptions, mycological anecdotes, 147 watercolor paintings of fungal species. She regularly corresponded with Charles Peck. He was one of the only people who gave her any respect in the mycological field. So, um, because she was a woman. But look at her paintings; they're so unique and so cool. I would love to have some of these framed in my house. They're so cool. 1871, here's that Paul Coomer guy that's came up a couple of times. He was a priest and a teacher and a mycologist, and he split those 12 tribes into many more genera that we're familiar with today, like Entoloma, Hebeloma, Pleurotus, Psilocybe. He did that too a lot. So he was like the original splitter, you know. A lot of people hating on the splitters. This is the guy that kind of really started it. We need more names, lots of names. 12 just isn't enough. 1890, Beatrix Potter came along, and you might recognize her name because she was a famous author of books like Peter Rabbit. She was a writer, an illustrator, a naturalist, archaeologist, entomologist, a mycologist, super fascinating person. She was wrote off by most academics of that time because of her sex and her amateur status. But through meticulous work, she had theories about spore germination. And later, after she died, she was recognized as being correct for a lot of her theories. So, got to give her some props. 1900, this guy comes along, Charles McIlvaney. If anybody knows this, this is the coolest thing. I mean, it's the most interesting mushroom book I've ever read. But he was a Civil War veteran. He fought for the North. He used the pseudonym Tobe Hodge for many of his writings. And he wrote this book called 1000 American Fungi, where he earned the nickname Old Iron Guts. And he set out to eat and taste every mushroom. Like that was his thing. And so Dr. Michael Bugh has a first edition copy of this book. I was so lucky to get to go and have breakfast with him one day at his house, and he like dropped the Bible of McIlvaney on the table. It was mind blowing. But let's look at some of the things that McIlvaney said. I'm going to eat them all. I don't care what has been said, he said. So sulfur tufts, Hyphiloma fasciculare, we know this to be a pretty toxic mushroom, cause really bad GI upset. He said, old authors give it as bitter and poisonous. The bitter is not always present. Any there is disappears in cooking. It's not poisonous, but one of our most valuable species. I have eaten it since 1881. A little lemon juice or sherry will cover the slightly saponaceous taste, sometimes present. If you've ever nibbled and spit one of these, it is so bitter. I don't know how. But only the caps are good. It makes a choice pickle and a good ketchup. I would not take his advice, but it is fascinating. The emetic russula, some people call this the sickener or the vomiter. I began testing this russula and soon found that it was harmless. At least 20 persons ate it in quantity during its season for 4 years. Yet in many published articles, I continued, out of regard for the opinions of others and in an excess of caution, to warn against all bitter and peppery fungi. But from that time until the present, I have eaten it, and I have made special effort to establish its innocence by getting numbers of my friends to eat it. Oh, no. Don't go to his dinner parties. Like, it was suggested by one of its prosecutors that perhaps I was mistaking another fungus for it. In October 1898, I sent Professor Peck a lot of the russula I was eating, and he wrote, "It seems to be aromatica, as you state. It certainly is hot enough for it." And then this one, I just threw the book across the room. The Funeral Bell. Yeah, Galerina marginata. They called it Foliota marginatum back then. But he says the caps of this small Galerina, seldom over an inch and a half across, can be gathered in goodly numbers where it frequents, probably because nobody else is picking it. And they are of excellent quality. I don't know what for, but yeah, again, crazy. If you ever get a chance, there's actually a PDF version you can read for free online. I suggest everybody go home and read A Thousand American Fungi. 1902, George Washington Carver, our first black mycologist to be recognized. He was born to slave parents in Missouri. He was just interested in the natural world. He was known for developing techniques for improving depleted soil on cotton plantations, which is a little bit ironic. Um, he titled his work "New Alabama Fungi" contains 60 fungal collections, new species that had never been described, and he had two species named after him, so that's kind of cool. Metasphaeria carveri. This is like a grass rust that got named after him. Not the most prestigious fungi to get, but still cool. So, Rolf Singer came along, and he was a German mycologist who fled to Spain during the Nazi regime. And then he went to France, then to the US, then Argentina, Buenos Aires, Chicago, where he retired. He was all over the place, and he studied a lot in like Central and South America. And he had already published 5 papers by the time he was 16 years old. He went on to publish over 400 scientific papers. He published his work, Agaricales in Modern Taxonomy, in 1962, which did what the Friesian system did in 1821. So it evaluated and codified all of the fragments of what was known of macro and micro features into one cohesive text. So he was like, we're going to take all the microscopy and all of the other old stuff and we're going to put it all together. And so here's his book, Agaricales in Modern Taxonomy. And I just love these illustrations. They're so just textbook, if you will. The foundational model for mushroom taxonomy before genetic DNA analysis. It was based on features like spores, the basidia, which are the cells that the spores get born on, and other visually observable parts of the mushroom. He described 86 new genera, and he published over 2,460 specific names for fungi, mainly in Central America. But yeah, really cool. These are the basidia right here, and then the spores, which are kind of neat. He even drew these little oil droplets, and these are little drips of nutritional um, broth, if you will, for the germinating fungi to feed on. It's kind of like a little to-go meal for them. In 1957, this guy got famous, R. Gordon Wasson. So he was an amateur mycologist, and he fell in love with mushrooms on his honeymoon, where he and his wife found edible mushrooms, and their fascination began. And I think he just had a really genuine, innocent fascination with mushrooms. They both began field research with a focus on ethnomycology, so really curious about how people were using mushrooms. That's the science of ethnomycology. And he noticed differing attitudes between the Russians and the Americans regarding mushrooms. In Russia, it's a mycophilic culture. They were taught to forage at a young age. You go to their markets, there's tons of different mushrooms, and over here, there's just not very many. So they became fascinated. Published Mushrooms, Russia and History in 1957. He suggested that Amanita muscaria was the actual Soma elixir, and he wrote Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. It was one of his first books. And in his studies of the cultural use of fungi, he heard accounts of mind-altering mushrooms used religiously in Mexico. And so him and his wife went on a journey to Mexico. They claim to have been the first Westerners to participate in a psychedelic mushroom ritual. I'm not going to go too deep into that. It's like a whole talk in itself, but Maria Sabina, she was a religious teacher down there who fed them these mushrooms, and he came back and told Life magazine about it, and they published a big article in this issue of Life magazine, and all the hippies got in their vans and raced down to Mexico and kind of ruined the whole deal. And yeah, it ended up turning out not so great. I really do think that him and his wife kind of had good intentions going into it, but the way that it all got blown up really sucked. And she kind of was exiled by her community and stuff like that towards the end of her life. In the 1960s, Alexander Smith, he was a curator at the University of Michigan Herbarium. I believe he came here a lot. He was in Oregon a lot. He was known for being critical of other people's work that he deemed inadequate. And in his career, he collected over 100,000 specimens that are housed at the University of Michigan's herbarium. At least 7 mushrooms are named to honor him. He wrote over 200 publications and books, monographs, and a popular field guide, the Mushroom Hunter's Field Guide, which sold over 100,000 copies. So he was known for over describing species. One time he published 28 synonyms for the same Hibbaloma mushroom. So now there's like an informal award in his name for people who describe too many species that are synonyms. You get the Alexander Smith Award, I guess. So Smith is kind of where I have to draw the line as far as mycologists go on this talk, because we're going to start getting into living people. And then, I've already left out so many people. I'm sure, some of you are thinking, well, what about so and so? I was trying to stay within the guidelines of what Stunts had written, and I just don't want to leave more people out. Um, so the 2000s into a new age, new molecular evidence in the form of DNA barcode interpretation began, starting a new epoch in fungal taxonomy. So the concept of DNA barcoding, pioneered by Paul Hebert for butterflies, was applied to fungi and has become a powerful tool for identifying fungal species. The development and widespread use of DNA barcode markers such as the ITS, or internal transcribed spacer region, significantly advanced fungal identification and characterization. So mushrooms are being moved all over the place now due to this DNA stuff. It's been like that for a while, but it doesn't seem like it's going to slow down anytime soon. And you can start your own DNA lab at home for under $500. And perhaps in a decade or so, we'll be able to just put a small piece of fungal material like in a flash drive and plug it into your computer, and it'll just say what it is. But I talked to Stephen Russell. He said that's at least 10 years away, which seems very optimistic if you ask me. Um, so the main purpose of all of this is to contribute to a better understanding of field mycology. A human observing mushrooms to understand their natural world is what it's all about. So you can help contribute to the understanding of fungal taxonomy by uploading your mushroom observations to iNaturalist. iNat offers many projects that provide free DNA sequencing, so you are literally part of helping understand fungal diversity and taxonomy in your own corner of Mushroom Wonderland. Um, and as somebody mentioned, I went to Kauai in January on a fungal biodiversity survey, and then I got news today that I discovered a brand new, never described before species of Entoloma, and it's on iNaturalist. So how cool that there's still things out there to be discovered. We just need to like get our cameras out and do the thing. So that's it. Thank you. And the YouTube channel started in 2020. It was kind of a product of COVID. Um, I started publishing some mushroom videos back in like 2012, but I didn't know anything about YouTube or any of that. And I was making videos just about everything, just because I went to college for video production, and I was always a mushroom nerd, but I never put the two together until I went on a morel hunt. And I was like, I should make a mushroom hunting video just about how to find morels. And I got a bunch of views. And then I was like, maybe I should just make a channel about mushrooms. And um, there's like Yellow Eleanor. There was a couple of channels out there, but Rachel has kind of not been making too many videos. And I was like, I'm just gonna start doing it. And luckily I met like Alan Rockefeller and a couple of other people in the community who were just like so generous with their knowledge and kind of helped to really put the channel on the map. And since then, now I've got like over 110,000 subscribers just on YouTube. And Facebook's pretty big and stuff, so it's really cool. I'm starting to expand out of the Northwest, but yeah, it's cool to be down here. And I love Oregon. Got to do all the festivals on the coast last year, and the Oregon coast is just phenomenal in the fall.